Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you and welcome to Islam and Life with me, Tariq Ramadan, broadcasting from London. In today's show we ask the question, what are the main acts of global oppression today and how can Muslims resist them?
Oppression is a state of being subjugated to a state of cruelty. Resistance is the practice of combating it. Human oppression began with the very creation of mankind. The day on which Prophet Adam's son, Qabil or Cain, kills his own brother, Habil or Abel. To understand the origin of oppression will help Muslims resist its present forms. Today's Islam Alive asks, what are the main acts of global oppression today and how can Muslims resist them?
Global oppression is a big term and a big concept, and we know that there are many types of oppression. It starts with the political oppression, we have economic oppression, we have cultural oppression, and we have also a new type of racist today, what we call Islamophobia everywhere, not only in the West, not only in Muslim minority countries, but also in Africa, where, and it's worldwide, when, for example, Muslims are targeted and described as potential terrorists. So we have many types of oppression, global oppression, and when it comes to the Middle East, when it comes to Africa, when it comes to Asia, we have something which is a type of new oppression, not always political, but very efficient, very effective. How can Muslims resist these types of oppression? How could they understand the very essence of this oppression and how it works, and then resist them and try to change the situation, to free themselves from oppression? Because at the end of the day, oppression is to prevent you from being autonomous. How can Muslims become autonomous, independent, and be the subject of their own history, and in which way they can deal with this, not to oppress others, but to free themselves and to try to be active and contributing to a better future for humanity? These are critical questions, and to answer all these questions, I am joined by my guest, spokesperson for the Islamic Human Rights Commission, Razak Azim. Thank you so much for being with us today. Let me start with this, because we are very often talking about oppression, and there are many types of oppression today, and Muslims are at the center of many discussions. It comes to politics, religion, culture, economy, and even being citizens in the West is something which is problematic, and sometimes we have a sense that we are not talking about equality, we are talking about structural discrimination. So let us start with global oppression. How do you understand this concept, and what would you put in it to make it clearer for our viewers?
I think we need to start off by actually thinking about recognizing how this oppression is actually recognized. It's about making sure that you understand that the rights that every human being should have, including you as a Muslim, to be able to practice your life, your religion, your whatever it is that you want to be able to, you should be able to do so. And that is something, if that is impacted on, and you mentioned the things about economic oppression, cultural oppression, and all of political oppression, which will stop that from actually taking place, then minimize the way that you could actually set limits on how much of what you wish to practice you are able to do. That's where the oppression kind of like begins to manifest itself.
Yes. Would you summarize the whole discussion by saying, when you are prevented from getting your basic rights, this is where oppression starts?
I think so. I think this is where you've got to recognize that as a starting point, that this is where the problems, you've got to recognize how the oppression is actually taking place. Often we talk about oppression and people are not actually aware that they are necessarily being oppressed, and you have situations actually developing, and where people are oppressed and yet they feel comfortable in the life that they are leading, and they continue to lead that life because they don't want the status quo to change. So there is often the situation where you don't actually recognize that oppression. We see this in for example, the slave trade. We had the situation where, as Malcolm X described it, the field Negro and the house Negro, and how those two kind of were different, and in terms of how the house Negro was more interested in protecting the house of the master and making sure of the well-being of the master in a way that the field, as Malcolm X describes it, the field Negro hated his master because of the oppression that was being carried out, but the house Negro was oblivious and was quite happy in the way that he was actually living his life, and he wanted the master, if the master wasn't well, then he was concerned, are we not well? Malcolm X describes this, that he has internalized the well-being of the master into himself.
Yeah, that's exactly the point, is internalizing your own status by accepting or not being aware, and even sometimes working for the oppressors in a way which is confirming your own status within this equation. Now, what we are talking about here is how can we, as the starting point, make the people aware of all these types of oppression, because this is the starting point. The means for you to resist or to liberate yourself is first to be aware of what is happening. And very often people are saying, or talking about Muslims, saying, you Muslims today, you are nurturing a victim mentality. Everything is about, we are not liked and the people are targeting. And what you are saying is that to be aware of what is happening is one thing. To nurture a victim mentality is something else. In fact, to be aware, to avoid the victim mentality and to resist, this is the goal of the whole process. How can we achieve that?
I think it starts with awareness, in actually beginning to recognize in the different ways that oppression is actually taking place. Often we're not, we've internalized it to such an extent, as I gave in the example of this, the slave trade example, that even in today's society we've internalized our situation to such an extent that we expect that certain levels of oppression will take place, and there is no point in saying anything about it because nothing's going to change. And the point is that one, if you don't recognize that this is a problem, and two, you're not prepared to do anything about it and to resist against that, then nothing is going to change. Nothing changes by itself just because you wanted to change. The slave trade and all of the paraphernalia that went with it didn't stop because suddenly the people, Wilberforce or anyone else suddenly thought, oh, isn't this a bad thing? There was a problem. And it wasn't possible for it to continue. That's why it changed. And there was resistance against it. And in the same way, we need to recognize it. I mean, there was a project that the Islamic Human Rights Commission did, British Muslim Expectations of the Government. And in that project, we were looking at the idea of to what extent people felt that Islamophobia was being directed, or they were being discriminated against as a result of their beliefs. And it was interesting that the people that felt the most discriminated against were the ones who had reverted or converted to Islam, because they recognized what they had before.
Exactly, yeah.
And what they didn't have as a result of it, and they felt that oppression or that discrimination at a level that many people from minority communities had accepted as part of the living reality.
Yes, they are so used to it that it becomes the natural state of affairs. So let me put it simply now. If you look at the situation around the world and you have to assess the situation, are the Muslims oppressed? And if yes, how and in which field?
I think Muslims are oppressed, and they're oppressed in many different arenas. And whether it's by Western governments, and you've talked about the global situation, or it's by Muslim governments, I think it's irrelevant. The point is that the majority of the people, majority of the Muslims are living in a state of oppression, and
this is what the majority of the Muslims around the world.
Majority of the Muslims, yes, because if you look at some of the things that are going on, whether it's in terms of the state being able to provide some kind of security, allowing Muslims to be able to practice their beliefs and to be able to engage in this idea, sometimes even this idea of separating church and state, that is such a Western-driven phenomenon, that if you try and mix the two things, it's something that is not acceptable, is in itself oppressive to many people who actually believe that there is no separation within religion. It is a complete entity in itself, and it's something that encompasses all aspects of life, as has been said. So it's a question of actually recognizing where the problems are, and in different places around the world, those problems exist in different, manifest themselves in different ways. And it's a question of saying, okay, how does it manifest itself in the situation or in the country or in the place that I find myself in, and what is the mechanism? First of all, recognizing what the problem is, what that oppression is, and what are the mechanisms that one has to actually deal with that oppression or resist that oppression. And when there aren't mechanisms, what mechanisms need to be created in order for that resistance against that oppression to actually take place.
Okay, but let us take an example. We were talking about the Arab uprisings. We are talking about these people demonstrating against dictatorships and dictators and freeing themselves. After 2 years, what we see, for example, in Egypt is the coming back of the military, even worse than what happened before. So there was a liberating process, and now we have this coming back, and this is plain oppression on the side of the army and what the army is doing. So what can the people do, for example, in many situations in Muslim majority countries when we have dictators, you have petro-monarchies, there is nothing about freedom, the people are oppressed on many ways. And still, for decades, we were saying in Muslim majority countries in the Middle East, nothing is changing. What could they do, in fact, as a first step towards the liberating process?
I think it's important to recognize who the enemy is, what the nature of the enemy is, and where this is all coming from. And since we've just had the Hajj and Eid, etc., one of the things that actually take place is that you have the Satans which you throw stones at, and you have the big Satan and the small Satan, etc. And I think we need to recognize, or symbols of the Satan, as it were, that we throw. Okay. And now we need to recognize who the big Satans are, and where those things are actually being controlled from. And that when we embark on a narrative, are we embarking on a narrative where we don't actually recognize who the real enemy is? And often when you talk about these situations that has happened in Egypt and so on and so forth, and in other Muslim countries, that there's conversations about how this has been hijacked, the military is taken over again, so on. Where is that coming from? Who is the military backed by? We talk about military, but if you trace it back, where that power of the military actually comes from, we take it back to the Americans and what has actually been done in terms of saying where the problem actually lies.
That's true, but at the same time, you were saying something which is very important, that sometimes is coming from abroad, is coming from great powers, United States and other countries, or the European countries, or even the relationship with others, with the new actors in the BRIC countries. They are involved in all this business, and we know that there are conflicting interests. And at the same time, you are saying in Muslim majority countries, you have the governments who are doing this to their own people, and this is happening today. And then in Egypt, what is very worrying when we are talking about liberating the country from oppression is that you see so many citizens now supporting the military against their own freedom, against they are supporting against the elected president, for example, and they are saying this is the way. So we sometimes wonder, how can this be a country which is going towards its own freedom and liberating itself from this kind of oppression? And this is not only coming from abroad, it's coming from within.
I think we need to recognize that these things where people are supporting these kind of juntas and so on and so forth, and this is put forward as something that is really being supported, it has happened throughout history, where resistance movements have actually risen up, and it's about making sure that the majority of the people begin to recognize. I mean, some of these people don't recognize what the problem, what the essential issues are. It's like if I go back to that point about the slave who's the house Negro, who is more concerned about saving his master's house than perhaps the master is himself. And it's that kind of a mentality that exists, that until we begin to recognize the slave mentality, the colonialism that is we have internalized. And I would say that by saying that the army is part of, that they're supporting the army, then what you have done is actually supported something where you have allowed that colonial process to embed into the minds of the people to an extent where this is actually taking place. So again, the issue there is one of the issues there is, for example, the awareness of the people. That is the army going to be the solution to their problems?
Okay.
And they haven't recognized that the army is not going to be the solution to their problems, because for the last 30 years or so, it wasn't the answer to their problems, and it hasn't been. It's got a proven track record. And
so how do you raise the awareness then? How do you do that?
I think that's
because this is the point. Which are the means that we have to change this mentality, to change this, because this is something that we find everywhere. Even in the West, where we are facing structural discrimination, new racism, Islamophobia, you have Muslims and Muslim citizens and leaders saying, you know what? It's our fault, because we have to be less visible, we have to cope with the situation, we have to please the people, we are in a host country, and they are developing exactly what you were saying about the home Negro, which is just saving. It's as if we are, not in our society. So you have the rhetoric is also the same.
I think, first of all, you need to recognize, as those people that have recognized that this problem exists, that there is resistance that is required against this oppression, whether it's in the society here or in the society in other countries and so on, where this problem is actually taking place, that you need to link up with those people who are going to have this idea of decolonizing and recognizing that the colonialism that the Western powers wish to have continued, whether they wish to have that continued directly or indirectly through institutions like the Egyptian army or whatever, people who are against that colonizing process that has been going on for years, it is important that we link up. We recognize the struggles of other people who are not just within Muslim countries, not just within the Muslim world, community, and it's got to be beyond the Muslim world, because, for example, Hugo Chavez, and the support that he gave to Hezbollah in 2006.
And the Palestinians as well.
And the Palestinians and his track record. He's not a Muslim, right? Now, in the same way, that resistance, that idea of resistance, wherever it emanates from, is something that is central. Rising up against oppression is central to what Islam is about, what the Muslims should be about, and what we have been I think, taken down a blind alley where we have adopted an approach of Muslim nationalism, which is unfortunate, because our religion and our prophet is, the idea of Rahmatul lil Alameen, and it's for the world. It's not restricted to Muslims, and it's that kind of an idea that we need to keep in mind, that our remit is to make sure that we bring together these strands of resistance that are there in different communities, and try and make sure that we can support those people in the countries, whether it's in our country, whether it's in a country like Egypt or anywhere else, where those strands of resistance can be supported. And they can be supported in different ways. One of them is going to be awareness raising, because without awareness raising and making sure that those people can understand that, what kind, in Malcolm X's language, are you a field Negro or are you a house Negro? Where do you stand?
That's an important point. Yet now, the main problem, when we are facing this global oppression, and there is something like this, while what is sometimes worrying is to see Muslims, ordinary Muslims and leaders not being aware. Some are trying to avoid this big question of how do you promote autonomy, independence, freedom and dignity for Muslims today? Is it a problem of the followers or is it a problem of leadership? Because you are talking about Malcolm X, but Malcolm X was a leader and he knew that he was in danger. He knew that what he was bringing to the table was going to be dangerous for the United States of America, and he was killed at the end. Is it a problem of leadership?
I think the issue is there are people who are leaders in all countries, including this country, of the Muslim community and others, who have that attitude that Malcolm X actually has. And there are people who can do what needs to be done in terms of taking on the responsibility. And that's when it falls to the followers to recognize who those leaders are, or who those people are that can lead in the way that people need to be led.
But if they are not aware, it's a vicious circle. If they are not aware, how are you going to make them aware?
It's something that people need to recognize, that this is a problem. One of the things that Winston Churchill said was that the empires of the future are the empires of the mind. Now, he recognized that these physical colonialism is probably not something that is going to continue. And he recognized where this problem is going to be. Now, if you look at Steve Biko, the resistance fighter in South Africa, he said the most potent weapon in the hand of the oppressor, in the mind of the oppressed. Winston Churchill, basically someone who wanted to continue the colonizing process, and Steve Biko both recognize where the problem actually lies. Both of them leaders in different sides of the spectrum, if you like, and yet unless we recognize that this is where the problem actually starts, that we begin to understand how our minds are colonized, how our minds are enslaved by the system, how we're not prepared to understand what is the important and right and our right to have. Unless we can liberate ourselves, liberate our minds, we're not going to begin to recognize who the leaders are. Malcolm X stood out because he had a following. Not every Muslim followed him, but there were people who followed him. And the point is that he was a character, that it was something that we needed to recognize, that this is something that's going to continue. We have the people, we have some of the followers, we need to have more of them.
That's a very positive point, and it's a very important point, because very often what we have coming from the Muslims is that the leadership is not there and the leaders are not there. And what you are saying, you were saying at the beginning of our program, which is very important, it's all a question of being aware that we are oppressed and to try to identify the types of oppression that we are facing. We talked about the cultural, the political, the economic oppression, and within the Western countries also something which is a reality, Islamophobia, and then to be able to raise this awareness, to educate the people, and to be able also to find the right leaders to come with an understanding, a vision for the future, which is in fact something that you are saying is there. We should hope and promote a better understanding, communication and identification of who are the people who can lead the communities and the Muslims around the world towards this resistance. Well, that's all we have time for. Please let us know your thoughts and views on any of the shows you have seen. And here's the way to contact us.
We at Islam in Life would like to hear your views about the subjects that we discuss. We would also love to hear your suggestions for our program, so get in touch with us. You can share your thoughts with other Islam in Life fans, engage in debate, and find out how to watch our previous shows. Follow us on Twitter at Islam in Life TV, or join us on Facebook by liking our page, Islam and Life on Press TV.
Finally, I would like to thank my guest, Reza Kadim. Thank you so much for your insight, and I hope to see you next week, inshallah.